everyone, and welcome to today's podcast episode of Where Does Your Journey Stem From, hosted by myself, Dr. Karina Minardi. Today we are joined by an exceptional scientist, Natalie, who is a graduate student at Texas A&M University. Let's welcome to the stage, Natalie. Hey, Natalie, how's it going?
Hi, Karina. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So Natalie Coleman is a PhD student at the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Texas A&M University under the Construction Engineering Management Program. She's a graduate research assistant at Urban Resilience.AI. Research examines the social disparities and risk inequalities associated with disruptions in infrastructure services during the disaster impact. She's particularly interested in integrating the physical and social vulnerabilities of impacted communities to promote equitable infrastructure practices. Disaster research to understand how communities recover after natural disasters and hazards such as Hurricane Harvey, Winter Storm Uri, and Hurricane Ida. This includes quantifying system losses, promoting data transparency, and emphasizing human values in the management and restoration of infrastructure. She currently has 11 accepted journal articles in Sustainable Cities and Society, the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, and scientific reports. Props to her. For her research, she has been awarded the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, the Aviles Johnson Fellowship, and the PEO Scholar Award. Coleman is the president of the Women in Science and Engineering, a committee member for the Civil and Environmental Engineering Graduate Student Association, and Bill Anderson Fund Fellow. Coleman is passionate about promoting the next generation of students, and she has mentored over 25 undergraduates, volunteered for the undergraduate research division at the university, and advocated for research funds as an Aura Scholar. She regularly presents to K-12 schools with the belief that anyone can be a researcher. That's a powerful message. So welcome again, Natalie. We're excited to have you. And thank you again for joining us and giving us a little bit of a bio as to your background. But I want to know more about you and who you are. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I'm from Laredo, Texas, which is a border town between Texas and Mexico. So I grew up there my whole life before I moved over to College Station, where I got my undergrad in civil engineering. Started getting involved in undergraduate research after Hurricane Harvey hit Texas. Mostly did work in the Houston area. And so I've been working on my PhD for the last 4 years now and just trying to stay up to date with figuring out like my whole life, I guess, if that's how you can phrase it. But besides research and all that, really loved reading. I'm actually like in a monthly book club with a couple of my civil engineering friends from undergrad. So we've been keeping that up pretty well. Love to go thrift store shopping, scrapbooking. And yeah, that's just kind of the introduction about myself.
That's really cool. And I'm excited. I was on a podcast a couple days ago, and we were talking about reading and how it's really hard to keep up with reading in graduate school because you're reading so much science. So that's props to you for having a book club and keeping up with that. How did you get introduced to STEM and or civil engineering then prior to your undergraduate experience prior to your undergraduate experience?
I think in high school, I had the chance to shadow a civil engineer in Laredo. They had this like program where you could shadow professionals. At the time, I didn't really know what I wanted to do in college. I knew that I had to go to college, just wasn't quite sure in what. Was really interested in math and science, but when I was following around the civil engineer for the day, I really realized I've always been fascinated with structures and buildings and just how they're both very prominent in our lives, but we can tend to sort of ignore them. You know, we don't really think about the road not working or the power not coming on. But then you notice that they're there and, you know, it's hard to miss. So applied to the engineering program at A&M. You start off in general engineering, and then that first year you have time to sort of get familiar with other engineering majors, and kept going to a lot of the civil engineering based seminars and getting really interested and involved. And so I knew that that was the perfect degree for me. And I've loved it ever since.
So you said your school had a shadowing program, and I'm curious about that. Who else did you shadow? Was this just a one-time thing? How did they match you with, areas?
Yeah, so it was actually a one-time thing that they did for several high school students in Laredo. I think it was through the New Optimist Club, I believe. Initially, I was supposed to be shadowing somebody else, and then I remember waiting in the lobby for a while, and then them saying, "We have this last-minute match for you." And so I got along really well with her. She was able to take me to the wastewater treatment plant in Laredo. And from there, just started getting more and more interested in structures. I will say I did take a lot of structures classes, and it's needed for my degree, but I'm not in the structures route. I like looking at buildings, but calculating the forces and all that is just a lot. So I'm more in the construction management side of things, but still a civil engineer at heart.
That's really fascinating, because I was thinking a lot about matching careers or introducing, high school students to careers, and how do you actually do that beyond just reading about a career, like actually having, and maybe all the way to, on the spectrum, to an internship. But I think shadowing is really powerful because you actually live and breathe what the person is doing on a daily basis. So that's really powerful. So tell us a little bit about your undergraduate experience. If you didn't know necessarily what you wanted to do, how did you make that determination?
So I think at A&M, it's a lot easier to get started in the engineering fields than try to do another major and test into it. And so I started engineering. The first year was personally really difficult for me academically. I loved my high school teachers, but I think just the area I was in and the type of high school I went to, I wasn't as prepared for the math and science classes like some other of my friends. And so learned for the first time how to do calculus, learned how to do physics, because I did a general physics class in high school, but nothing that was prepared for the classes. So that first year was really testing me to see if I wanted to stay in engineering. Luckily, I got really connected to these other civil engineering girls who I'm still connected with. They're the ones that I do the monthly book clubs with. And being able to study with them, being able to bounce off ideas and just stay persistent really helped me succeed that first year. I remember calling home that first year and telling my dad that I was not going to make it in the program. And he sort of reminded me that the other students had a year or two on me to learn this material, and that once we got to material where none of us were familiar with, like my study habits, my determination, we were going to be at the same level and catch up. And so I think that really helped a lot. And like I said, A&M has a program where the first year you're not really in a specific engineering major. You have to apply to a specific one. So I went to a couple of the civil seminars, really liked what people were doing, talked to some students that were more far along in their degree program, and realized that I was more interested towards that. It wasn't until I started doing undergraduate research that I really wanted to do a little bit more of the data science part of civil engineering that has been gaining more and more popularity. But yeah, that first year I think was really critical in whether or not I was even going to stay in engineering.
Well, there's the core curriculum, plus on top of that study habits, plus on top of that, what is your background? Are you you teaching yourself stuff from scratch? Are you relearning stuff that maybe you didn't completely grasp before? But then that's the coursework part, right? And then there's the research part. So talk to us a little bit about your introduction to research, and I think what you find fulfilling, I think, in civil engineering research.
I was very fortunate to have we call him PhD student mentor that kind of guided me through the research. I saw the sort of snippet of the research project in the research lab at like an engineering research fair that they had for students. And so I reached out to the professor, Dr. Ali Mostafavi, let him know that I was interested in civil engineering, but at the time didn't have any research skills. But I was really passionate, and I think he took a chance on me, put me with a PhD mentor named is now Dr. Amir Ismailian. And he kind of taught me a little bit more about this social side of civil engineering that wasn't really taught in my classes. So this idea that certain people or certain groups aren't able to get equal access to engineering systems, especially during times of disaster, which I had sort of seen growing up in a more lower income area in Laredo. The area is just not as maintained as other areas. And so for me, that really resonated with me, how people can struggle to get what they need when in times when probably that need is the greatest. So he taught me a little bit more about the literature going into it. So I read a lot of not only civil engineering research, but a lot of disaster research, social science research that goes into it, and sort of eased me into the statistics side of things, survey development. So every semester that kept going on, I got more and more interested and more involved in the research. So for me, it was a gradual process of first understanding why the research was important. I personally found a strong connection to it because of my background, and then just slowly gain the skills that I needed to be successful in research.
I think your story is not unique in the fact that you have that sort of learning increase of acquiring more and more skills with time. And I think so there's that, in addition to most people do actually get introduced to research through happenstance, and so tell us a little bit more about how did you actually meet that PI to understand, I want to do research with you, what kind of lent itself, how did the conversation go?
Yeah, I think so. At the engineering fair, I had actually reached out to a couple of professors, drafted a type of email saying, I'm a sophomore student in civil engineering. These are the classes I've taken. This is my resume, which probably at the time, if I think about that email, I probably made a lot of mistakes, but reached out to the professor, and then he reached out to me, said that he was interested in an in-person interview. And so we were able to talk about what I was interested in at the in-person interview, but he also made it clear what kind of projects he was involved in. I also did some prior reading before the interview, just kind of Googled his name, saw what kind of research he was doing. So he was aware that I had read his publications, which is something I tell some of my some other people if they're interested in research. If you find a professor that you're really passionate about and that you want to get connected to, send them an email first of all, and if they make sure that you cite their work, like what you're talking about. Because the big thing with researchers is that they like to talk about their research. So if you're able to sort of bring that into the conversation, at least it gets it a little bit more started. At the time I had just reached out and I didn't have a lot of strong research skills. But I was able to develop it through time. And so I think a lot of people think that they need to have a strong skill set before they even reach out. But yeah, they don't need to at all. I feel like if you show that you're passionate about it, that's going to take you a lot farther than you realize.
Well, what I appreciate about you is that you took initiative to actually reach out to professors. And even if the email was horrible, air quotes, horrible, you still took the initiative. And I think that that's not only highly appreciated, but it also shows a sense of drive, of willingness to learn too, which I think is tantamount. And it's not leaving it up to chance either, because I'm sure you selected which professors you wanted to contact based off of what they were doing as well, which is, I think good in the fact that you knew going in what you wanted to do. So tell us now, I think, a little bit about what you're focused on right now. Tell us about your research, we already talked a little bit about it from their bio. So if you could give us an overview, and then we'll talk a little bit more in specifics.
Yeah, so one of my first research projects was trying to understand this idea of which types of people and populations were most affected after infrastructure outages during Hurricane Harvey. So focus more on flooded roads, power outages, communication outages. And so we surveyed about 2,000 people in Harris County and asked them kind of what was their level of hardship, how many days did they go without infrastructure, what was their level of tolerance. So the idea that I try to explain tolerance is, if you go home right now and you find that the power is out, how many days can you last without power? Is that idea of tolerance. And so looking at that, we were able to see that lower income communities and minority communities were most affected by these service outages. And so I thought I was going to be doing a continuation of that in my graduate research. But what I sort of got moved into more is trying to find a way to quantify those losses besides survey data. So survey data is very important, but it can have a couple of issues in terms of the time it takes to collect the data, memory bias. Participants may not want to be asked these questions right away, especially when they're dealing with losses. And so we're trying to use more, I would say, human mobility data to see if people can access their essential and non-essential services. So can people go back to their grocery stores or to their medical facilities in a reasonable amount of time? It's sort of the way that I try to explain it. And coupled into that is still that idea of understanding equity standards, trying to blend in some data science into it. So I'd love to elaborate on it.
I do have a question about tolerance. So you said you define it as how many days without power could one last, or a family or household. Does that, and I'm just curious, is that sustenance? Is that power? Or not ground power, but like generator power? Is that psychological? Is that emotional? Like, how do you actually quantify all of those factors? Because I would assume that that is part of tolerance.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think so that sort of research with tolerance is more that my PhD mentor, Dr. Smalian, worked on, but I was in a couple of co-authored papers with him. And the idea is that we asked people this question of how many days can you last without power? And then also asked other questions based off of their demographic information, their risk perception. Did they have alternates to the service? Like you mentioned, power generators. Some people filled up their bathtubs to have water, or they had water tanks, or even something as simple as bottled water or candles and flashlights. we tried to put them all into a model and see if those influence the tolerance level of people. So we tended to find that people who had power generators had a higher level of tolerance, but also people who had power generators were more likely to be higher income. But they were also more likely to have experienced the storm before. And so you factor in that experience, those demographic features, that preparedness. So it all kind of fits together. I know that there are probably a lot more social science models out there that can explain into preparedness and all of that, but that's just kind of the interpretation of it.
And then I guess another question for the health enthusiast in me is, when you think about social determinants of health in conjunction with socioeconomic status in defining tolerance, do you also look at sort of health trends with sort of things, disease burden post-disaster?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I know that with the survey data, we did ask people if they had a loved one that they were dependent on, if they had a chronic medical condition, if they had mental and or physical health issues. So I really wish sometimes I could go back and, add more questions and perspectives into that study. But you bring up a really good point in terms of health. Something I didn't really mention in my bio was that I was involved in a couple of projects related to the COVID-19 pandemic and trying to see if there was any sort of disparities between people's ability to socially distance themselves during the pandemic. So we actually used mobility data to see if people could distance themselves. And we found that lower income communities were not able to as much, which might be because, a lot of them work the jobs that are more classified under the essential service category. So they weren't able to socially distance as much or work from home or so it's just, there's a lot of different factors when you talk about the disaster research space. You have engineering, but you also have health and well-being and things that I haven't even touched upon, but are really important fields on their own, like community development and policy. So it's just a lot into one.
When I think of it too as a sort of cyclical in nature too, because they impact one another, and they have this sort of, health impacts your social determinants, which also impacts your, transportation, which also impacts your health, and so on and so forth. And so it creates sort of this cyclical, vicious cycle, for lack of a better word. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently working on then? Hypotheses, what is your current hypotheses? Let's talk about current work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of my current research projects is trying to take this idea of the phrase that I'm using is lifestyle behavior related to infrastructure services. So a lot of the infrastructure services looked at from the physical point of view. Lifestyle is kind of this idea that people have different routines and habits that they do to access their essential and non-essential services. So they tend to maybe go to the grocery store 3 times a month or go to their local gym, twice a week. And so those are things that get impacted in the middle of a disaster. And so that's something that I've sort of tried to quantify using that human mobility data, seeing if people's lifestyle changes after a disaster. And I know the term has different meaning in like health and like economics, but the way I'm using it is more, how can we bridge the physical system of infrastructure with the societal needs that people have on those systems?
So what is your current hypothesis? Give us an example.
Yeah, so I think some examples that I have is that people have specific lifestyle. So each person has a particular way that they interact with infrastructure systems. And you might be able to, my hypothesis is that people in similar areas or of similar demographics have similar lifestyles. And so if you can understand the lifestyle of people, you can sort of target certain areas to be able to help them after disaster. So if this area has greater dependence on grocery stores, you might target those areas for food accessibility. Or if another area is more dependent on medical facilities because it has a higher elderly population, you might be able to target that one more for medical access. Those are just kind of ideas in my head. As of now, I've just been sort of using more exploratory and unsupervised learning to try to bring everything together. So I hypothesized that, initially I thought that these connections would be most understood, but now that I'm looking into the research, I'm realizing I might need some more complex data tools to really answer the questions that I'm looking for.
Well, and so I was taking notes as you were saying that, and I guess the first thing that kind of popped up into my head was geographical region. You have not only urban versus suburban versus rural, but you also have different parts of the country. And so I was thinking, are you thinking about modeling and creating a sort of model structure so that can be then transposed given certain parameters and certain sort of variables? Then you can essentially kind of advise, FEMA for certain areas. Is that kind of the use case?
Yeah, I think that that's the ultimate goal, is trying to, right now we're focusing on Harris County because, it's a large population. It keeps getting impacted by disasters over and over again, not only with the flooding, but also COVID-19 and the winter storm Uri that happened in Texas. And so it's a good space to sort of understand those different interactions. I don't want to say issue, but sort of some things to consider when you're trying to apply the model elsewhere is, Harris County has its own demographics and it's very urban. So if you're trying to apply it to a more rural area, or even to an area up north that has different political and government structures that might play into it. But that would be the ultimate goal, is being able to transfer this model elsewhere. And also, rural communities don't have as much data availability as urban areas. And so that's something else to consider. Would it necessarily be a situation where we transfer the direct model, or will we transfer the methodology, or will we transfer some, general key insights, maybe a general toolkit? That's something that I hope to continue in the future.
Well, I think the other point to that is most of your work is focused on sort of post-disaster. And so when you think about post-disaster, you can have, Kansas tornadoes. You can have, I'm in Washington, and so snowstorms, or even the Northeast. And then how do you juxtapose, tornadoes versus snowstorms versus hurricanes? And are there ubiquitous factors that maybe you could, change in the model or not? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. No, and you bring up an excellent point, because a lot of the work that I've done is mostly related to flooding. And so those conditions change a lot when it comes to a tornado or to a wildfire. And something else is what we even consider as essential and non-essential. So for an idea, I'm kind of talking about like grocery store is essential, and then a gym center is considered non-essential in my model, for example. But in some communities, those recreation centers are places of community and places where people really gravitate to after a disaster. And so even the idea of separating essential and non-essential is really dependent on the community itself. And so I think a lot of my PhD work is doing, the theoretical side of the model, but something that would really strengthen it is getting some community feedback, working with community leaders, that I hope to do in the future to really elevate Is this model worth your time? Are you wanting just some key insights? Are you wanting more of a framework? So that's something that I hope to do in the future.
I love that feedback because it's you're essentially developing something for someone else's utilization, and then how do they actually harness it for their betterment and their community's benefit. So, and I think feedback is quintessential and required, I think, for a lot of that. So I appreciate your time, and I appreciate all of the discussion so far. I do want to ask you one last question before we end. Is that, reflecting on your career so far, 10 years ago, what kind of feedback, what kind of words of wisdom would you have imparted to yourself?
So I'm going to age myself here, but I'm talking back to my 15-year-old self. So that's very, very back in the, yeah, I did undergrad to PhD straight into it during the pandemic. So everything's kind of been on fast mode. But I think talking to my 15-year-old self, I think at the time I didn't realize how, I don't want to say how smart I could be. I think I didn't realize that I could be successful in a different space. Again, I was in a high school where I had a lot of supportive teachers that saw something in me that I didn't realize. They encouraged me to apply to a university outside of my hometown and to apply to scholarships and to do all that. And I think if I didn't have somebody to support me, I don't know if I would have been able to have the strength to pursue those opportunities. And so I would probably instill a little bit more self-confidence in myself, but also say that it's okay to fail. I think it would have made that first year in college a lot less stressful if I was more aware that failing wasn't this big limitation or this big setback. Research itself, everything doesn't go quite perfectly. And so that's something that I also would like to tell them is that, hey, as you embark in your college and you're eventually going to do research, it's okay if you have to scrap a 3-month project and start from square one, or if you fail that exam that you thought you were going to pass, or, and to also find the people that are supportive in your team, supportive in your work, supported in your social life, because you're more than just a researcher and a student. You're a whole person, so you want people to be able to help you there. So yeah, I think those main things of be a little bit more confident, find the people that are going to be able to support you, and be able to be okay with some failure along the way.
I think it takes a village. I love that you talked a little bit about that. And it's so apropos. I saw this post on LinkedIn earlier today, and it showed 2 pictures of the world. They were exactly the same image. And they said, look what happens when you fail. The world is the same. And I think to what you're talking about, it's, and my point to it was, yes, the world is the same, but what did you learn from your failure? You may have failed, but that's a learning opportunity. Especially in research. I think I can at least attest for myself in saying that I actually learned more from failing than I actually learned from succeeding, which maybe not is the best, but I think it's actually pretty good, frankly.
Yeah. Well, you have to force yourself to be more creative, right? And then view things in a way you might have not realized it. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree with that.
So with that, Natalie, I thank you for your time. I thank you for discussing your background, your research. It's some fabulous stuff. I wish you all the best. Hopefully you have 1-2 more years. Cross your fingers.
Yeah, I think it's between 1 to 2 years. We'll see how it goes. Hoping to still stay.
Okay. Crossing both fingers then.
Yeah. We'll see.
All right. Well, best of luck. You are ABD at this point, so that's good. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in today. And don't forget to always ask yourself, where does your journey stem from? Thanks all. Bye.